Hi there, and welcome back to Season 3 of Sciburst, a podcast all about science, popular culture, and entertainment. This podcast is for everyone, no matter if you're a tea drinker, martini sipper, or appetizer enthusiasts. We are your hosts, Ella.
And Isabel, two science communicators and solarpunk enthusiasts, taking this podcast on a journey into hopeful futures. This episode, climate histories, climate presence, and refuturing, and why we need solarpunk now.
Right now.
So we're going to cover all the problems and blockers we're currently facing in the world of climate action, a bit of history about the discovery of climate change, and how solarpunk can help in radical and imaginative ways.
Absolutely. But before we dive into that, it's really important that we acknowledge that this episode of Sciburst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, as always. Dawra Nuna, Dawra Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nali Manyin, Duni Manyin, Ngunnawal Wari, Dawa Wari Dindi, Wangirilijin Yin. This is Ngunnawal country. Today we are all meeting together on Ngunnawal country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders. And of course, we extend those respects to all the traditional custodians of the lands that you're listening to this episode on. And if you don't know whose lands you are on, today is a great day to find out and connect some more with that culture and country. So this episode. So exciting. We initially dreamed this episode to be a history of solarpunk episode where we dive really deeply into what started solarpunk, how it grew initially, and where we're at now. However, the where we're at now bit was really sticky and it's so compelling. So we've changed tracks to that parallel story, which is what got us to wanting and needing solarpunk. That's the story we're telling today. We want to know how we got here specifically. So today we're presenting to you an episode on why we need solarpunk now.
Yeah, and I'm realizing, and maybe you felt this way too while you were researching for this episode, I was like, gee, maybe we should have started with this one for the season.
Yeah, it's a bit of a start at the end kind of thing, but we're coming to this with all the context from the earlier episodes that will guide us through and give us some touch points and some anchor points for what we're learning today.
100%. We also have so much to say. We have 12 pages of notes.
This may be the most pages of notes Sciburst have ever attempted.
We're very passionate. Okay, so let's dive in.
Yeah, so today we're going to go through the histories of climate change, quote unquote, discovery, what actions followed that discovery, what stories were told, and then eventually what alternatives were dreamed, aka solarpunk. And just a little thing I wanted to guide us through this episode. At the start, I wanted to say that this episode is going to be quite complex. It contains complexities. And I know, and we know, talking about climate change can be really emotionally triggering or vulnerable for many of us. And this is because the problem can seem too big or too unknown or too unsolvable. But I want to remind us at the top of this episode that at its core, this is a podcast about hope, nuance, optimism, and learning together. So keep that in mind. We've got you, we've got each other. And we're going to hold all these complexities and we're going to have a really great and hopeful time doing so.
Yes. And on that note, I wanted to get us all into that headspace by starting with a quote from Isaiah Johnson. And I think we've quoted him before from his study in the Journal of Sustainability Education. Can't remember which episode it was, probably multiple episodes. Anyway, he says in the paper, quote, while there is no silver bullet to fight the growing nihilistic resignation of climate grief, there are good reasons to believe that solarpunk is an important part of the fight, which is exactly what we're going to get into today. But first, we've got to go a bit back in time.
Let's learn why solarpunk even needs to exist.
Yes.
So we're going to start with some context about climate change discovery. And unfortunately, a little bit about failed climate action. So we're going to run through a brief history. This is really brief of climate change science. And this is mostly taken from Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science.
It's over there if you're watching on YouTube.
This is a book I turn to time and time again when I need those like really quick refreshers on the facts, and it's got a great timeline at the start. So we're going to jump off from that too. Thank you, Dr. Karl. So we start in the mid-1600s. It's 1654, and the first continuous weather service, the Medici network, was continuously taking measures of air temperature across Europe. So no climate change found at this point, but this is important for establishing some of the really early science. We then jump to 1824. This is 200 years ago for us, now in the future. Joseph Fourier, a French physicist and mathematician, was asking some really great questions about weather's atmosphere, and he first recognized what we now know and call the greenhouse effect. Basically, his published work states that the Earth's atmosphere somehow traps part of the sun's heat, and that makes the Earth's surface a little warmer. So these are the first little tingles. Then we jump to 1856. Eunice Newton Foote, who is an American scientist and women's rights campaigner, she discovered that of all the gases, carbon dioxide has the capacity to become the hottest, so it can heat up the best. And she predicted in 1856 that an atmosphere of carbon dioxide would indeed raise our atmosphere to a high temperature.
Wow, so that was way back in 1856. It's a long time ago.
A long time ago. And simultaneously not that long.
Yeah.
So we still have written records from that time. 4 years later, John Tyndall, an Irish physicist, he experiments and proves that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does indeed let heat in from the sun and traps it from leaving. So he's kind of proving what Joseph Fourier in, 30 years previous had suggested might be true. He says, yeah, you were pretty bang on. We jump to 1894, and Arvid Högberg, a Swedish geologist, maps the carbon cycle, showing the natural and human-influenced movements of carbon. 2 years after that, Arvid then works with Svante Arrhenius, and in 1896, Arrhenius shows that human activity is making the Earth's atmosphere warmer. So this is a little over 100 years ago. We know that human-linked activity is changing the climate. Jump to 1930, and Guy Stewart Callender, great name,
Yes.
who's an English inventor, shows the link in carbon dioxide levels and fossil fuels. So this is the first link there.
Yeah.
Linking human fossil use specifically to the exact human activities that are warming the climate. And now it's the 1970s, and the scientists are getting louder. One of the biggest industries at the time reacts to climate change, and that's insurance.
Of course.
Jump now to the next twist, which you genuinely won't believe. In 1977, big fossil fuel companies wholeheartedly throw themselves into climate change and carbon research. So a few years later in the 80s, they're teaming up with scientists and they're making really reliable predictions, and they're doing really good science. So you have insurance companies and fossil fuel companies backing climate change is real. Of course it is, but also doing the work. Now it's the turn of the century. It's 1998, and climatology is now a field, publish a game-changing paper in the Nature Journal, showing that the sharp temperature changes in the post-industrial world are happening. It's referred to as the hockey stick graph because it ticks up and then up again, like a hockey stick. And this is where the positivity starts to run out.
Oh, no.
So through the 1990s, there's also a movement of big fossil fuel companies moving away from their science phase and starting a science denial phase. Specifically, they're denying climate change.
Right, because they're so well equipped to do that because they have all of the knowledge as well.
And they've been working with the key scientists.
Yeah.
This, unfortunately, turns into a huge disinformation campaign attempting to discredit the science, particularly of that amazing hockey stick graph. And some key scientists even receive death threats as part of this.
Whoa.
It's a really hectic campaign. So that's all up until the turn of the 2000s. We're now in the new millennia, and what's happened has happened in our lifetime. Fossil fuel companies, they work as usual, they're subsidized by governments, and there's a resistance towards electric vehicles. It's estimated that conservative groups spend up to $1 billion a year on denying science and opposing climate change action. Children are sometimes taught about climate change, but with a generational climate change action delay spin. A phenomenon that lives in the Western collective consciousness. It's the generational thought that it's too late for us. The next generation will save the planet.
Yeah. It's so frustrating.
We grew up in a social media landscape where sometimes an estimated quarter of climate change denial messages are sent by bots. They're not even sent by humans.
Great.
And we're in a place where political agreements on climate change do, in fact, not agree and change a lot. So that's a brief history. And what can we learn from this summary? Already we see a lot, and I do apologize for the extremely Western lens here.
Oh, yeah.
We see a lot of international Western scientists operating across multiple disciplines and fields. We've seen the links of discovery, and then we've seen some other players hit the scene, players who want to keep the pollution status quo, and they start to manipulate the story. So this is where we can see science kind of lost control of the story and therefore the action. And this is really a large part about why I want to be a science communicator, cutting through the findings and giving them an accessible story home, all this evidence, and therefore make less room for expensive propaganda to work.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's definitely one of the reasons why I'm a science communicator too. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for that, great history and making it so short as well, because it's such a complicated history, and I feel like you summed it up really well.
Well, it's kind of just like discovery. Oh no.
Yeah.
As soon as it starts to become really conclusive, we start to see people who want to protect and benefit from keeping the current status.
Once they realize they're going to lose money, they're like,
And another reason, why we work in science communication is because science needs communicators.
Yeah.
Scientists aren't all communicators, and they shouldn't have to be.
Yes. And so keeping everything that Ella has just said in mind, I wanted to add that science gave us the knowledge of human-induced climate change, but this doesn't always mobilize societies for action.
Absolutely.
As we have seen time and time again throughout history. And it's taken so long just to get even a little bit of climate action. We know from research, for instance, that facts don't convince everybody or always inspire action. So we need something more than just explaining facts over and over again. And up to this point, climate change has been framed mostly as a scientific or policy problem, which I think can scare people away because they're like, it's science, it's policy, it's too technical for me. I don't want to deal with it.
And they're things that have traditionally had really big elite and class barriers too. There's a reason for that.
Yeah. So more framed more as a scientific or policy problem, less so as a cultural or imaginative one. But this is starting to change, as we'll get into a little bit later. And also global awareness has grown a lot. There has been action, including with more international agreements, lots of grassroots activism. There is change happening, but there are still some deep-rooted problems.
Yeah.
And global emissions are unfortunately still rising. So we've still got work to do. So I just wanted to point out, we should also acknowledge the fact that there has been work, but that there is still more to do, and good work too.
Absolutely good work. Yeah.
Yes. So I also wanted to, before we dive more into the problems that we're having at the moment, bring up this quote from this cultural theorist, Mark Fisher, in his book, Ghosts of My Life, which was published in 2014. He said, quote, "Right now, it doesn't feel like the future. Or alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. We remain trapped in the 20th century. The slow cancellation of the future has been accompanied by a deflation of expectations." And we'll dive more into this later again, but I just thought this was a really good scene setter for what's to come, and also really resonated with me because I certainly feel like we're trapped in the 20th century not just in terms of our storytelling, but also how we're approaching the wicked problem of climate change in the Western world. And honestly, we're really missing out on building something, a really positive climate future that could be incredible by trapping ourselves like this.
Yeah, and that's, again, why solarpunk is so important. Let's break out of this, this monotony that we've gotten ourselves into. So now we have all this background on the science. And this gives us an inkling for what the direction is that history has gone in. And now with that direction, that context, it's time to focus on the problem. It's not actually that much about the science. It's where we've been led to. What has happened or not happened as a result of information and then communication. So we present part 2, the problem. This is going to be a little negative, but it's really important to hold this, understand what's happened, not happened, where it's gone wrong, so that we can understand why we need solarpunk now and why we need climate action now. So one of the problems is COP targets are constantly being reset or not adhered to. So I'm going to kick us off by talking about the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. So you'll remember this is right as the hockey stick was coming out. So this was negotiated at COP3 in Japan. So this is the third COP, Conference of the Parties. And here there was an agreement for 38 industrialized countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5% compared to 1990 levels. Already at this major decision point for an international body of countries, we see some major players being left out. And we start to lose countries like the US, China, and India from being fully on board with this agreement.
Which are like major polluter countries. So,
So already with the good, we're seeing some disagreement, some, non-adherence. So we try again. In 2015, the Paris Agreement.
Oh, no.
We've heard so much about this one in our lives. This is negotiated now at COP21. It's a new governing framework for global emissions reductions, and it's basically a follow-up to the Kyoto Protocol because it wasn't strong enough. This is a legally binding international treaty, and unlike Kyoto, this protocol required all countries, developed and developing, to make national pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The agreement calls on countries to review and strengthen their pledges every 5 years, beginning in 2023. There is a lot of hesitance that this will work, that this has worked, that it is working in the media, both professionally and on our own, personal channels. And most countries, unfortunately, seem to be taking a minimal viable product approach. They're doing the least they can for the longest and hoping at the end they'll be able to pull a rabbit out of a hat and reduce the most in the last 5 years.
Exactly. It's this checkbox thing, right? Where they're like, well, we did something, it's like you could be doing more than that.
And the more we do, there have been, I'm pretty sure, modelling studies done that show the more we do sooner, the better it is for people overall.
Yeah, and I also wanted to point out that it was only in 2023, so 3 years ago from the time of when we're recording this podcast episode, it was only then that the first time in the 30 years of UN climate negotiations that countries explicitly agreed to transition away from fossil fuels.
Something that, let me just go back, something that we know has been linked to climate change for over 100 years.
Yeah.
So, or pretty much 100 years. So 1930, Guy Stewart calendar linked climate change, carbon dioxide, human activity.
Yeah, and it took that long for it to be like explicitly mentioned and written down and people signing off on it in UN climate negotiations. So we're seeing a lot of slow change.
Yeah. But change.
Yeah. Yeah. And just with all this in mind, I wanted to say that the way that we're doing climate governance right now is still resetting goalposts and about checking boxes rather than larger action and really transforming systems, which is like the big problem, I think. And I wanted to go on from there to say that national commitments alongside like COP targets and all of that are often watered down too, and even today. So most recently here in Australia, and if you're an Australian, you would know exactly what I'm talking about and everyone's going to roll their eyes. In late 2025, so last year, our federal opposition, luckily not the current government in power, didn't do this, but the opposition, the Liberal and National parties, abandoned commitments to net zero targets by 2050, with the argument that these targets will supposedly drive up power prices and harm industry. But, the planet doesn't matter, I guess. So that's in Australia. In the EU, they've been criticised for diluting the Green Deal, as it's called, by doing things like lowering climate targets and reducing environmental regulations, which was ultimately driven by a mix of economic, political and agricultural pressures. So there's always external pressures that are forcing government bodies to water down
and this
commitments.
Is kind of part of it being a wicked problem.
Yes.
It's inherently entwined with economic, political and agriculture systems and pretty much every other system on Earth.
Yeah, exactly. In Brazil, Congress approved a bill in May 2025 that also loosens environmental licensing requirements, which a lot of critics argue might accelerate deforestation, which is a real problem. And then, plus fossil fuel projects are still expanding everywhere. So,
yeah. So the watering down, the reduction of these targets, the saying one thing and doing another, that's pretty real.
Yeah.
And is often a part of people's climate anxiety and grief and frustration, particularly with governments who could be the ones to implement large system scale solutions.
Yeah, which is really frustrating. Another problem we're having at the moment is greenwashing and performative sustainability, which is something we talked about in, our greenwashing episode. So we're not going to talk too much about it here. So go check out that episode if you want to learn more. But it's basically where companies are using sustainability language while continuing harmful practices and not taking meaningful action. So sustainability for these companies becomes marketing rather than structural change, and makes sustainability and climate solutions feel like branding exercises.
Yeah. So for example, some companies may preach sustainability whilst specifically engineering on purpose for planned obsolescence, say in digital devices, as a way to almost force you to have to upgrade products like your phone yearly or every 3 years. And you best believe these companies then don't take responsibility for that e-waste.
Of course not.
So,
of course not.
I think the performative aspect of that I really want to highlight here.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got problems with COP targets, we've got national commitments being watered down, we've got greenwashing. Another big thing, which
really big,
we've talked about multiple times throughout this season, is the media being dominated by dystopian narratives and dystopian visions of the future, which we still need these perspectives, but they shouldn't be everything we consume about our climate future. And these sorts of stories are in our news media through stories like ones about extreme bushfires or polar bears and koalas losing their homes, but also in popular fiction like Mad Max and The Day After Tomorrow, which emphasize climate catastrophe and societal collapse. Which, again, we need these versions of the story to show like just how bad it can get, but it shouldn't be dominating as much as it is right now.
Yeah. And I wanted to add here that even non-fiction narratives, like the news, we still see climate change being presented as a debate with both sides given equal airtime or equal credibility.
Yeah.
So it's not just even in our narrative fiction, it's also in our non-fiction media.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about why and really dive into media and its specific relationship to climate change action not happening in a positive or sustainable direction, and instead reinforcing the other. Mm-hmm. So this is going to be a little bit of like a media literacy kind of like upspeed kind of segment, because I thought it's so relevant here. And I think the more media literate we are, the better we are at spotting when things are deceptive, when COP targets aren't going to be met, when media rhetoric and narratives are telling us things that maybe we don't want to believe, but we just do because they're in front of us. Mm-hmm. So media spin can make us perceive almost anything in a specific way.
Sure
and
can.
That's why media literacy is so important. And remember, when it comes to the climate change problem, it's a wicked problem. So everything is interconnected. So any media you see can have, and a lot do have, messaging that is about climate change. And you've got to think about, who owns those media conglomerates? What are they getting out of? Are they in power? Do they get to keep it by putting out this message in even a kid's TV show? And what's led us to failed climate action is a lot of things, but some fall directly out of the Climate Disinformation Handbook. The method of deny, deceive, delay.
Yep.
Deny the science, deceive the people into an alternate reality or an alternate version of doing good, and delay climate action for as long as possible. And this is something that is being tackled internationally, this climate change disinformation, particularly in the last 3 years. So I want to talk about tactics that we can use against the very same tactics being used against us. So I've been following a lot of Savannah Bananas Unlearning series on social media, where she talks all about marketing playbooks and how to upskill your literacy. And she starts with this idea that media is playing to a model of distraction, then divide plus conquer, to give us a loss of agency and then a loss of hope.
Yeah.
So division of people leads us to not finding solidarity in others. So this division from the divide and conquer. And then we other communities because of this. So one point that's really powerful here that she demonstrates is it's really important to recognize when we're being divided and conquered. One example is by creating an addicting social media algorithm. This algorithm could keep you hooked for hours. And then this is further levered by media companies by making you feel awful for scrolling. It's doom scrolling. It's bad for your health. And then they reiterate that we're cooked, that we're done for, so that you can never feel hope. And this lack of hope keeps you paralyzed from action.
Yeah.
So one of the important things to do, when you're feeling bad on a social media scroll, is it because what you're seeing is intentionally making you feel bad? Sometimes that's the case. Is it that we call it doom scrolling and we say it's bad for you and you've got those associations with us? And then what are those things designed to do? They're designed to keep you distracted and divided.
Yeah.
So Savannah Banana also talks about the tactics of distraction, where entertainment makes us susceptible to messaging via distraction or by misinforming us by shaping narratives, including omitting and burying the truth. And she talks about needing to learn to take the poison out of the honey. What is the entertainment value?
Oh, I love that.
And what is the hidden poison messaging that they're trying to get to us through? And she didn't make this about climate change. She made this about general media misinformation. And already as I'm reading that, you can hear misinforming us by shaping narratives, omitting and burying the truth. We can see that this is very much at play in the Climate Deniers Handbook. And she talks about how media propaganda works because we love simplicity. Now remember that climate change is a complex problem. So it works because we love simplicity and it's tiring to think beyond the face value. So one of the best ways to break this and to improve your media literacy is to begin asking questions and introducing nuance. Do you believe what you've just heard is true?
I think it's also like, do you believe what you've just seen is true too, not just heard? Because I'm thinking about all the problems we're having now on social media with AI generated content as well. Definitely lots of parallels.
If it seems too good to be true, is it? Yeah. And she talks about this friction, and the friction, the bit that tires you, is worth it. And, you know, that's kind of what we're doing in this podcast. We're talking about really complex things and the reasons behind them. And we're talking about the methods people use and marketing and media people, which we are also of, to get you to think a certain way, and how you can use those tactics right back to identify them. And the reason that people use these tactics is because, again, if they're in power, you keep the status quo because your motivation is to stay rich, stay powerful. It's not to live in a good world. And these classic tactics, the divide and conquer, the distract, the keep things simple because sticky messages stick, like quick messages, simple messages stick. These are all classic tactics to stop social change, to stop community, and to stop action. So they're directly related to climate change, and they're all inherently entwined in this climate crisis. But the good news is that in learning to spot these tactics, we can become a little bit more immune to this type of poison.
Yeah.
So not related to the narrative side of this, but also very much related to all narrative fiction and media you consume. And unfortunately, it's always worth doing the work to ask, why is this person telling me this, presenting this information in this way? And for Isabel and I, you know, right now we'll be upfront. We're telling you this because we believe solarpunk is the way forward, and we see all these things as problems. We're not really hiding any hidden agendas, but also don't believe that. Like, question it. Question what you think is true.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all really good points. And I'm going to go check out that person's stuff because it sounds amazing and also just really helpful for us as science communicators too.
They're really good, but they do get to this point where you're like, no, I know I'm better than this. And she talks to you and she's like, if you think you don't do this, you need it more. She just knows exactly how you're thinking. It's all from those psychology marketing playbooks. And she was basically, her story is she was a marketer and she got so fed up with the propaganda she was creating. She now does like unlearning anti-propaganda media training for social good and for NGOs and not-for-profits.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is she's really cool.
She's really cool.
Okay, great. So I sort of wanted to round out this section by saying that all of the problems that we've mentioned here creates public cynicism.
Yes.
In some cases, like you've pointed out earlier, climate grief, climate anxiety, and action paralysis, so the freeze response. So have we maybe in some cases unintentionally built narratives that make the future feel unlivable rather than worth fighting for?
And some people have built that on purpose for those reasons.
Yes, exactly. So sometimes it's unintentional, sometimes it's very intentional.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And again, while we do need those negative stories as a way of highlighting the extremely damaging impacts of climate change, like increasingly extreme weather events, like biodiversity loss, like food and water insecurity, like human and animal displacement, we also need to be shown alternatives. And I think a lot of us, certainly me, certainly Ella, have fatigue from the dystopian media, and it's time for different kinds of stories to inspire us and balance things. Because if every imagined future is catastrophic, we're going to struggle to imagine a positive, sustainable future that we could actually be working towards. Because if we can't imagine it, we can't build it, which again, we've talked about multiple times throughout this solarpunk season.
Yeah. And I want to take that idea just one step further, that the things we're imagining also have to be compelling and compelling enough to overpower the dystopian or the more negative versions. So there's this book called The Myth Gap: What Happens When Evidence and Arguments Aren't Enough. Does that sound like climate change for you? This is by Alex Evans, and thanks to my colleague Tom Viedeman for bringing this up to me right before this episode, bringing this example to mind.
Thanks, Tom.
This book talks a lot about evidence and arguments and how essentially that's not enough to win arguments, because arguments are won by narrative and the myth that's in our head that perpetuates. So, for example, climate change action at a specific time couldn't overpower the image of you'll have to lose your car. For us to achieve excellent climate change sustainability, you'll have to lose your car. And that image of losing that personal part of your functional everyday life was so big, it didn't matter what was being offered, what evidence, what arguments. And essentially this book argues that we can't expect too much from factual evidence alone, especially with climate change, so that factual evidence won't change minds or start action. There has to be more.
Yep.
So what is that more? Where are we going next? What do we need? I think it's time for part 3.
I think it is time for part 3. So you guys already know because we talked about it at the start of the episode, but part 3, we think the solution is solarpunk. And in this section, we're going to talk about why we need solarpunk specifically right now. So our argument is that we need something new, a new story that is not a large corporation's narrative. That's not the news media's narrative, not the government's narrative, not even the climate governance body's narrative. It needs to be grassroots and it has to be ours, not something that we feel like is owned by some large corporation with vested interests. We really need new stories, and this is exactly where solarpunk comes in and can help us.
Yeah, and it's all related to staying hopeful. And that's a key part of the stories that are ours and that are traceable. We know where they've come from. We can understand their integrity and their credibility, and stories that are built on connection and community, which some of those really large corporations, bodies, etc., they can't really be built on community and connection in that way.
Yeah.
And solarpunk stories, I think this is really important and something we've been thinking a lot about, particularly with our future research directions. Is that solarpunk stories aren't created by lone wolves or solo flyers. They're built together. They're built collectively.
Yes, they're inherently collaborative, and you co-design with so many different groups of people from different backgrounds from around the world. And that's the whole point. That's how you build something that's so special and compelling too.
Yes, absolutely.
That's going to speak to lots of different people. So I also wanted to say here that it's actually not just dystopian narratives that are dominating at the moment. It's also the repetition of 20th century and older Western stories, like what I was talking about right at the beginning of this episode. And it's ideas from pop culture about the future that have been around for over 40 years and haven't really been updated as the world has changed.
And it's changed a lot.
Exactly.
Why are we still doing the same narrative?
Exactly. And I have a great quote from Jay Springett, who's a hybrid environment strategist and cultural theorist. He has an excellent blog and an excellent video, which we're going to link to both of those. And so he says, quote, "Consider the visions of the future that are currently dominating the Western cultural sphere. Superhero movies based on children's comic book characters from the 1950s. June is a book from 1965. The Foundation TV series began life in Astounding magazine during the 1940s. The video game Cyberpunk 2077 is a vision of the future from the 1980s. More Star Wars, more Ghostbusters, more Highlander, more Resident Evil. The list is very long, and even ancient concepts like the gods of Norse and Egyptian mythology are remixed over and over again in their present-day iterations. According to Film Stories, there were 108 reboots, remakes and sequels in various phases of production in 2021.
Oh, that's too many.
Yeah. The owners of our cultural heritage treat narrative, myth, and our shared social imagination as a commodity.
Yeah, what gets funded is what's worked before.
Yeah, exactly. This was something that when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, he is like giving us the language to talk about this, because it's something I have felt like deep in my body and been frustrated about in terms of how our pop culture is at the moment, especially in the Western world. And he also says there's comfort in this, like we like the nostalgia, right?
It's simple. It goes back to that Media 101.
Yes.
Yeah.
It feels familiar and like an antidote to what he calls, quote unquote, the broken present.
Okay.
Yeah, where we feel like there is problem after problem, including those that are climate related, and we feel kind of like we're stuck. But it also perpetuates something called cultural fracking.
Ooh.
Again, loved this phrasing, love new language that I can use to explain how I feel, and love that somebody else did it for me. So cultural fracking, it's a phrase that was coined by solarpunk author Andrew Dana Hudson that describes, quote, the capitalist process of endlessly extracting new value out of the sedimentary layers of meaning that comprise mass culture from the past.
Ooh.
So like everything I've just talked about, essentially.
Yeah.
It's essentially that idea of treating culture as commodity. And because of this, quote, nothing new can be added, only remixed. The process adds nothing new to the cultural imaginary. There is a whole generation of people bereft of visions of the future to which they can lay claim. This is the defuturing process in action. We have no futures which we can call our own.
And I'd really love some.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the future, it kind of feels like at the moment is all owned by the others, the corporations, powerful actors with vested interests, who we've talked about several examples earlier in this episode. And I also wanted to call out here the lack of Indigenous stories about the future in our mainstream media in this sort of pop culture. And we did do more of a deep dive on this in our Oakapunk episode with Matthew Heffernan. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. Because solarpunk can help with this too. And I just think it's also important to point out the lack of Indigenous voices in the mainstream.
Yeah, and the lack of Indigenous futuring and the fact that we're remixing so much, but the only things that we're remixing is what have already been assigned value. Yeah. So, that's mostly things that colonizers have deemed important to them. Again, this is a very Western view, but the Western view is so self-perpetuating. It doesn't welcome in, those Indigenous cultures or fresh perspectives.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of every point here is also so entwined with the last one as well, I think is the general point I'm trying to make. I wanted to now talk about something a little left from center, which is not why we need solarpunk now, but what is happening about that need for change and about that need for positive futures, different versions of ourselves, a better tomorrow. And I want to talk about, and you're going to have to stay with me, I want to talk about some of the crossover in solarpunk aesthetics and solarpunk living, and the crossover with that with a lot of the trends following the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a time that made many of us assess the systems we are a part of. Sometimes, and for a lot of us, we assess those systems very critically. And this led to the rise of cottagecore. You stay with me. Cottagecore. It's an aesthetic. It's a movement. Sometimes it's a lifestyle. It's generally visual though, and it's kind of like this idea and the dream of a lifestyle where you're living in a cottage and you have your own garden and you're connected to other people and you have ducks and there's abundance and you live slowly and you have time to brew your tea and you get to dress pretty. And it took over during COVID, and a lot of the thoughts behind that were because we had to stay home. What can we do to make our homes the best possible place for us to be stuck in? How do we fantasize about that? And I want to talk because I've seen some people point out that if you just get the clips of the aesthetic of a cottagecore life and overlay them to some music, it can also look like the solarpunk life. And this happens with a lot of purposeful, connected, dreamy, whimsical, slow living style movements, aesthetics that are being really like popularized and idolized on social media. And they're so compelling that these shared aspects come across movements and trends, including solarpunk, but also including tradwives, cottagecore, slow living. And some of these can feel very ideologically far away, but they all kind of share a want for a change in the status quo, kind of in the same direction, even if some of these are linked to gendered submission and reliance. So while what drives you to them and the specific thing can be different, they've all got a shared almost endpoint, even though that endpoint in reality will look very different. And going back to the media message here, I want to draw my own brain to togetherness on the similarities of these groups rather than differences. The divisions aren't as important by the things and the elements that unite them. And I think ultimately all those aesthetics lean on wanting a change. And it's really important to find solidarity with each other. So I didn't think solarpunk would have anything to do with the trad wife movement, but there's a lot of things that people keep coming back to, such as connection to the land, even if that's, just through your veggie box, and living in a community. Maybe it's of other trad wives who you can also share produce with, but like maybe it's living in a community that has a really cool co-op. So yeah, these elements that unite us, I want to think about why are they all coming together.
Yeah, they're just showing up in slightly different like circles.
Yeah.
Right? And two things that might seem like they're very different, because again, like the trad wife trend has the whole like gendered lens, and it's got problematic elements.
In some ways it wants to keep the status quo, but in some ways it really wants to break them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the overlap is.
Yeah. So my point here is that we're seeing this rise in things, I think, because the ecosystem is right for solarpunk, it's also right for these other parallel trends and aesthetics and movements. And I find that really interesting. And I'd love to see more work about, uniting those factions or groups. Because I think there's some real potential for movement there. And this leads me into yet another Ella Ramble, TM, on current social media trends that I see and how they tie into a more sustainable future.
Yeah, okay. Let's hear it.
Hot takes. I am seeing a lot of low buy and no buy year trends where individuals become really aware of their buying habits, and they might create a set of rules. So what are no-brain decisions? Obviously, you can always buy, say, groceries. You can always pay your rent, always pay your bills. But what needs to be considered? So maybe new clothing you need to think about for at least a week before you decide to. Or I've seen some people who say, I'm only going to buy one new item a month for the whole year, which for some people is radically different to the lives they were living the year previous. And this has prompted, I think, some excellent repair work, of people saying, I want a new sweater because my sweater's got a hole in it. Maybe instead I'll just patch up my sweater. So we're seeing promotion of circular economies. We're seeing the defiance of fast fashion trends and heavy capitalism, and leaning instead into more ethical consumption. I'm ticking that off as leaning us towards a solarpunk future. Okay, this trend has been happening for a while. Veganism, meatless Mondays, plant protein, seasonal eating, farm to fork, farm to table, the whole kit and caboodle, visiting local farmers markets even.
Yes.
These can all be really good for sustainability in our local supply chains. And, often solarpunk communities are envisioned as self-sufficient. They have all these elements, the local markets, maybe eating less meat. We've seen that even in some of the games in our last gaming episode, that you can't eat some of the animals in that. You have to live harmoniously with them. I'm ticking that off. That's leading us towards more solarpunk. Another trend I'm seeing, people talking about personal curriculums, reading lists for critical theory, the rise of BookTok and Bookstagram. Being more well-read, taking in perspectives from across the world, challenging, questioning the status quo, increasing our media literacy, even if it's the current popular book, I see all of this as a good thing. And there's so much good coming from these trends, including resistance, because the more you read, the more you question, the more you think, the more perspectives you take in.
Yeah.
That's getting my tick of community approval.
I was going to add here too, to the whole Bookstagram thing. I've seen a lot of people reading books from banned books lists as well. That's popular at the moment.
Yeah. So while some things, you might say, oh, the latest romance book that's trending isn't going to improve my understanding of the world that much, maybe it will.
Some of it does.
There are also people promoting, classic books again. People promoting indie works. People promoting banned book lists. Why are they banned? What do people not want you to read about?
Yeah.
There's so much good in these movements.
Yeah.
So much good. Mm-hmm. And talking about good, my final one is the trend. And maybe this is just because we're Cyburst. But from my perspective, there looks like a real big trend of good news stories. And I want to talk about how these are essential for resistance, essential for restoring our hope, essential for rest, connecting us with others, and feeling like we can make a difference.
Yes.
Which, as we know, sometimes big social media algorithms don't want us to feel.
Yeah.
But good news stories help get us there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are all trends that I see that I think are saying and confirming, yeah, we want a solarpunk world.
I was going to add another one to here, actually, and it's kind of left field, but Whimsy.
Yeah.
Whimsy Instagram, which is literally saying, like, we want something different. I don't want to be living this, like, boring life over and over again, like, day in, day out. I need to add some, like, sprinkles and some fairy dust to what I'm doing.
And I would say Whimsy feeds into lots of those cottagecore, slow living aesthetics as well. And lots of solarpunk is built on whimsy, but instead of, like, I don't know, pink and purple whimsy, which I'm a fan of.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like brown and green whimsy.
Yeah.
And it's like how are we DIYing or modifying or adding to this in a fun way.
And it's like the future can be messy, but in a whimsical, fun way. Like, so it's a way of embracing the mess, and that it doesn't all have to be like super pristine and clean. And that can look like having plants everywhere and weeds and or
having something funky growing out of your hat.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, I think whimsy is also a rebellion against the now.
Yeah.
And a rebellion against what's efficient, because sometimes what's efficient isn't what life is for.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. So I actually really loved that. And I hope that everybody can take something away from their social media feed, and hopefully it's not too dark on your Instagram or wherever, and that you can see how there ties into some solarpunk thinking and sustainable futuring. I wanted to say, with all those lovely ideas in mind, that the missing piece feels like it isn't more information or more dystopia or more of the same, but new stories, new solarpunk stories that are compelling, inspiring, and hopeful.
Yes.
And while we're talking about this, in this episode, we did want to bring up our recent work on climate change fables.
Yeah.
And the power of fables in particular as a different kind of climate storytelling that can emotionally resonate and therefore inspire meaningful action. And I actually think some of the examples we've talked about are fables in a way, like some of those, I don't know, whimsy Instagram is a fable-like in a way, with like DIY and all of that, visiting farmers markets. And we did do a fables episode.
Way back in season 2.
Way back with literary anthropologist Professor Chris Dantar last season. So go check out that episode if you want more of a deep dive on fables and science communication. But we sort of want to expand on those ideas from a climate and solarpunk lens. Because fables usually have a powerful moral or call to action that taps into our emotions and can transform worldviews in ways that are different to dystopian fiction or science explainer pieces. Something they also do is decenter the human by having animals or technologies as the transmitters of wisdom, and simplify complex ideas so we can understand and imagine them. In some cases, they can be stories that model possible climate narratives and futures. And I think you could make an argument that a lot of solarpunk texts, like for instance, Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot series, which we've talked about multiple times.
And we also have in front of us today.
We do have in front of us, are fables, envisioning harmonious relationships between humans, technologies, the environment, and providing an inspiring example of what our solarpunk future could look like. So an alternative. And I also wanted to say here, this is also tied to Warren Ellis's concept of refuturing, which is another fun phrase I learned just the other day that I thought was super relevant to this episode. And it's this idea that just as we need to rewild our natural landscape, we need to refuture our imaginations. So we have to do it to our brains as well. And he says, quote, refuturing connects in my mind with rewilding, the sense of creating new immediate futures and repopulating the future space with something entirely divorced from the previous consensus futures.
So once again, we're talking about creating new narratives for ourselves. Perhaps we're using the age-worn method of fables, like we might use the age-old method of novel writing.
Yep.
But we're using that to display our new ideas in compelling, accessible storytelling forms that give agency to things that aren't humans. Because that's how we get to the solarpunk harmonious world.
Totally.
Yeah, that's all really beautiful. I'm going to keep that concept of refuturing with me. And I think a lot of the solarpunk work is that refuturing. We're not talking about a solarpunk world, which is the Jetsons plus plants. You know, that future, I think solarpunk is moving on for. It's refuturing a tomorrow versus 40 years down the line.
Yeah.
So this leads us to what is next? Will solarpunk become mainstream? Can solarpunk become mainstream?
I hope so.
So solarpunk is punk not because it's dominant in society. See our punk in solarpunk episode. Punk has to be in opposition to mainstream.
Yeah.
And many solarpunk creations take place in a completely changed society where sustainable living for them is mainstream. So in a meta kind of sense, solarpunk narratives aren't depicting a solarpunk society because once it's mainstream, the punk is kind of gone or transforms to the next thing. And I wanted to talk about, can solarpunk become mainstream? Will solarpunk become mainstream tomorrow in the next year? And I wanted to talk about the pretty solarpunk movie released in 2022 by Disney, which I watched last weekend.
Yes.
Strange Worlds.
Yeah.
It was not marketed. It didn't get really a proper mainstream cinematic release. And it kind of flopped. Even though the story I thought was pretty good, it touches on some very solarpunk elements and is pretty on the nose, which is as good as you can get with these big companies, kind of with environmental storytelling. But because it flopped, that is then going to make other big conglomerates from media question whether solarpunk stories are sellable.
Which is probably part of the reason why we're stuck in this content loop of like just reusing old things, because they're like, well, we know this sells, so we're going to use it again.
Yeah.
So we're going to pitch another Superman project, you know?
And other questions I have about will solarpunk become mainstream? A lot of solarpunk creations can come from, and we think probably should come from, grassroots, crowdfunded, community-sourced, collaborative beginnings. When big conglomerates like Disney come out with a solarpunk story, it doesn't resonate as much because it doesn't have that solarpunk and the punk beginning.
Yeah.
So, yeah, can it become dominant? Will it become dominant? Is it too punk?
I think there are signs that it's becoming more mainstream. Even just thinking about the last episode we recorded about solarpunk gaming, it's becoming more popular in the gaming space for sure. So we could see it. Hopefully that translates to other forms of media, like movies and TV shows. I also wanted to say that solarpunk is punk because it currently stands in opposition to the increasingly mainstream position that we live in a world with no future, which is another idea from Jay Springer.
And we do. This world has a great future.
Yeah, exactly. But let's say solarpunk does become mainstream. Okay. It's no longer punk. We can move away from how it currently is. And I wanted to talk about Jay Springer's other idea, which is moving away from the Anthropocene to the Anthropogreen.
Okay, I like those magic words. Say more.
Yes, which is a place where solarpunk is the mainstream. So the idea of Anthropogreen is a century of biology, return to nature, and re-engagement with the non-human living world. It's a civilization. The vision is that it's a civilization shaped by small gestures and what Jay calls gardener's hands, which I loved that phrasing, reinventing infrastructure and society. So digging literal ditches.
Getting hands-on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To transform and rehydrate landscapes, to lift people out of poverty and boost quality of life for everybody and improve the natural environment at the same time. And this is already happening all around the world. It's not talked about as much or given as much space in the mainstream media. And it's not super radical, as we also already have a lot of the tools to actually make this a reality, which is kind of the whole point of solarpunk too, is that it's supposed to be a near future, not something that's like 100 or 200 years down the line. Plus, as Jay Springer says in another quote, Kevin Anderson has said that there are no non-radical futures anymore, since we will either make radical voluntary change to decarbonize our systems or else be forced to accept the radical change that will occur due to the influence of climate and ecosystem changes. So the argument here is that radical futures are going to become a reality either way. So let's try to make that the radically positive option, not the other one.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
And I think for us to end up with that thought, starting off with climate change is real.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's not being treated like it is, to come to the point of, hey, our future's going to be radically different.
Yeah.
We can choose to make it radically positive.
Yeah.
And we can get there sooner and we can have a great time doing it. It's such a great place to end. And I hope listeners that if, you started this and you said, I'm going to put my climate grief, denial, anxiety, nihilism, whatever, on hold for you, I hope now at the end of this episode, you feel like that was worth it.
Yeah.
And that maybe there's something else other than those emotions waiting for you with the climate change fight, with the solarpunk story.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wanted to provide a little summary of all this space we've traversed together in this episode.
Please do.
So we've learned scientists, not necessarily communicators. And therefore, despite the rigorous findings and evidence, players globally with money, power, and who benefit from the status quo have controlled this greenhouse gas and climate change story and narrative. And we've learned these players use powerful rhetoric based on psychological shortcuts to deny, deceive, and delay action. We've talked about examples of that, where it shows up in our world, where it shows up in our media, in our narratives, and our entertainment. That is on purpose. We know these players further distract us, divide us, and conquer us to try to take away our hope. And this is where solarpunk comes in, because the hope is so essential here. We did a whole episode on optimism, kind of for that reason. It's so crucial and critical. And there's always hope, I want to say, especially in complexity. Having this being a wicked problem that touches every area of life in the world means that there's hope in every single corner.
Yeah.
And these are the corners that solarpunk plays in. And I think it's really clear and safe to say that we're both hoping and expecting for a lot more hope, positivity, climate crisis going awayness in our futures.
Yes. Yeah, we are. And we also both believe that solarpunk is something that can help us all do that as well.
It gives us to that future.
It gives us an alternative, hopeful roadmap that a lot of other strategies and stories don't provide, which is why it's so powerful and why we need it right now.
So sorry for leaving this episode to almost the end of this season, but we hope with all the context you've gained from other episodes that this makes a lot of sense. It grounds to you and affirms to you why we're spending so much time on solarpunk, why it's so important, how it's inherently entwined with the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And at any point you can jump into this episode again, any of our other episodes, and build up that resistance and that optimism within you to create those futures. So we hope we're leaving you with that. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, we're going to leave you with some good news stories.
Yeah, we are. Can't finish a Sideburst episode without this.
So, I have got to share with us today a very visually solarpunk and very mechanically solarpunk examples of good news. And I've taken it down to one story again. We're not doing this like 2, 3, or 5. And I want to talk about these new airborne wind turbine systems in China generating power from the spaces above cities.
Oh, okay.
And I'm so sorry this is a podcast, but if you think visually about all the things you've seen that is like solarpunk imagery, you will have seen an exact imagining of what is now being tested as these wind turbines. So if that doesn't speak about the power of creating new hopeful narratives that create change, I don't know what does. Let me tell you some more about these wind turbine systems. So the Scientific American states that S2000 Stratosphere Airborne Wind Energy Systems, or SWAYS, held up is essentially a helium blimp. So a big helium body filled that floats above the city, and the machine generates apparently 385 kilowatts of energy from 2,000 meters off the ground. So whilst traditional turbines generate energy by rotating their blades when the wind gusts and blows, and they send the power down a stem or the body of the machinery, you know, they're quite tall. These new designs do the same, but they look like a suspended or floating balloon.
I've just looked up an image so that I can see what it looks like, and it's literally like the how you imagine airships to look in solarpunk games and movies. In Loftier, I think.
Yes.
The airship looks a little bit like this.
So it's essentially that, but it's generating electricity from the wind up there and sending it down a cable, which is tethered to the ground or anchored to the ground. Zhenxiao Wang, a research associate professor of big data at Peking University, who was involved with this project, says that SWAYS has multiple environmental advantages over conventional wind turbines. Quote, we use up to 90% less materials than traditional wind turbines. We do not need massive concrete foundations or a steel tower or to disrupt the soil ecosystem.
Great.
He says it has a very small visual and sonic impact. It's basically silent at ground level and creates a much smaller visual obstruction on the horizon. End quote. They're calling this the world's first megawatt class high altitude wind power system. It's huge. If you have a look at the videos, and we'll try to post them too.
Yeah.
It takes up a space of 60 by 40 by 40 meters.
Okay.
And it's just kind of at this point where it's done some testing for grid compatibility.
Yep.
The other cool thing with this is it can also hold a variety of other functionalities, such as communication systems, weather systems, and they're hoping that while this will work with the grid, that it can also function as a stable conventional energy source for off-grid locations. Because you can just float a little balloon. It's a big balloon. A big helium balloon.
Yeah.
This is again from the Scientific American. Researchers reportedly conducted similar tests last September, and the machine is still a prototype. Although China is the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, the country is also the global leader in renewable energy, especially wind and solar. So I just wanted to end with that because sometimes the biggest polluters can also be the biggest creators, and I think we should be encouraging that. I think these new wind turbines look amazing. They look so solarpunk.
They do.
You have to see it to believe it. Again, sorry, this is a visual form, an audio format.
Yeah.
That's my good news.
Yeah. Oh, I love that one. I'm going to go find the videos immediately after this episode now that I've seen an image, but it's not enough. I need to see the video now.
But Isabel, I am excited to hear from your good news story because I almost picked this and I saw you picked it. You got in there first.
Wow, we must have the same places of getting good news.
I think so.
Spoiler, we do. Yeah, okay. Very good news for artists. In a world first, Ireland has made its basic income scheme For artists, permanent.
Oh, yeah.
So this follows a successful trial that ran from 2022 to 2025 to help artists during the COVID shutdowns. And because of the scheme, Irish artists, so this includes writers, painters, actors, makeup artists, and lots more, will soon be able to apply for 3 years of weekly stipends, a value of over 80,000 Australian dollars. So that's pretty good. And according to an independent study, the pilot scheme produced over 160 million Australian dollars in social and economic benefits for Ireland alone. So who knows what other grand benefits will come about from making it a permanent scheme now.
Investing in community is always a good idea, may I add. And this is the proof in the pudding.
Yes, exactly. And I wanted to share some insights and a story from one of the artists, Eleanor O'Donovan, who she was accepted into the pilot scheme a few years ago. And she says, quote, "Before I started receiving it, I was working part-time as a receptionist just to be able to afford my rent. I was thinking about moving to a country where I might be able to afford to live a bit cheaper. Now I work full-time as an artist. The scheme has given me the flexibility that the job of an artist requires and has allowed me to take risks. I have gone into film and I was able to pay other people to work with me on it. So not just herself, she was also able to pass the money on to other people who needed it."
Reinvesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So go Ireland, supporting the deeply important cultural work of the arts.
Because we can't get to that imagining the refuturing of solar punk and our futures without artists.
Exactly.
Crucial, integral, devastating STEM has been prioritized over arts for so many years.
And STEM is struggling too. So just it's hard out
but
here.
So happy to see this program, you know, working and then also being implemented, because sometimes we don't see that second step.
Yeah. And I hope that this means that we'll see other countries start to take it up as well as they see this working. So yeah, very excited to see what happens from that. But everybody, that brings us to our questions for the audience, the end of the episode.
The end of the episode.
I know.
Oh.
I know. So listeners, I wanted to ask you, if solarpunk ideas and visions were implemented today, what would your home look like in 2050?
This is great. And I want to add an extra challenge here, specifically when you're thinking of the future and your home in 2050. I want to challenge you to do the refuturing work.
Yeah.
Not relying on current visions of the future, but we'd love to know what your refutured version of that future would be.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I'm really excited to hear what people
Hope we get
come
some
up with.
drawing.
Yes, please send drawings. So as always, let us know on our socials at sci_burst or via our Gmail, which is sciburstpodcast@gmail.com. Stay nerdy, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Woo.